Chapter 12, Diversity, Multiculturalism, and Inclusion by Sita Patel, Kevin Tabb, and Stanley Sue. Presentation by Courtney Berrien and Madison Rodriguez.
Patel's article looks at community psychology perspectives on diversity, multiculturalism, and inclusion. Patel and her fellow authors look at the domains of diversity, primarily through the U.S. context, though they claim a transnational focus. They look at the framing values that community psychology brings to issues of diversity, multiculturalism, and inclusion. And they focus quite a lot in their literature review on community-based interventions, inclusive approaches to research, and other matters pertaining to diversity, multiculturalism, and inclusion.
In diversity analysis, community psychologists focus on individual and group differences, how we are like some others, and understanding that our membership in a social group can be self-defined, ascribed to us by others, or determined by circumstance. Diversity domains are broken down by Hayes' addressing acronym: age, disability that is developmental, disability that is acquired, religion or spirituality, ethnic and racial identity, socioeconomic status, sexual orientation, indigenous heritage, national origin, and gender. Implied in this acronym is the understanding that some groups have more power than others. There are some within group similarities in attitudes, values, and behavior that allow for cultural development, and this includes behavioral patterns, knowledge, attitudes, values, and achievements, but it also refers to norms, rules, institutions, communication, and socializations, as well as the distinctions that exist between groups and society at large. It's important to note that most individuals have multiple cultural influences and identities. For example, in the text it says a Latina lesbian can have both Latinx values along with values from the LGBTQ community. However, such diversities have been the target of centuries of oppression, domination, and imperialism, prejudices and discrimination, segregation and marginalization, violence, human rights violations, and even genocide.
So community psychology really emphasizes an appreciation of diversity and multiculturalism. These are some of the principles that guide community psychology research and practice. Rappaport noted that community psychologists incorporate collaborative research, qualitative approaches, ethnographic studies, and analysis of histories and narratives in their research. A key tenet of community psychology's approach to diversity is taking an affirmative approach. This is a strength-based approach that incorporates integration of multiculturalism and pluralism. And like other aspects of community psychology, context and culture are very important.
These are the overarching diversity principles that we're going to go through one by one. Principle 1 states that community psychologists study all domains of diversity and their intersections. Recognizing that all human beings belong to multiple cultural groups with diverse perspectives and backgrounds, an inclusive approach is taken and allows groups that have been silenced or ignored because of oppression and marginalization to be included in research, interventions, and professional organizations. Dominant groups such as white, heterosexual, able-bodied men, respectively, are also viewed as cultural groups with specific norms and values. Differences between dominant and marginalized groups are therefore viewed in relation to cultural norms and socio-political forces. Principle 2 states that community psychologists study diverse individuals and groups within their localized context. This allows for a focus on the intersectionality of diversity domains insofar as their differences and similarities. Community psychology seeks to understand how the context influences the meaning and experiences of the individual's cultural identities. Using the same diversity domain from before, the cultural identity of lesbian may have different meanings and lead to different experiences based on whether they are living in a rural or an urban area. The field also looks at differences between groups, such as lesbians versus bisexual women or gay men, and differences within groups, such as older lesbians versus younger lesbians. Grasping these differences and similarities has led to an awareness that individuals can hold multiple identities and experience multiple degrees of privilege and oppression depending on the context. Principle 3 states that community psychologists explore the variety of contexts within which diverse individuals and groups interact, as well as the historical, cultural, social, economic, and political forces that influence these interactions. To understand individuals, context, and their ecological location, along with norms and forces that influence interactions between the individual and the environment, are key. This is known as diversity of context. Individuals are influenced by the norms, values, and policies of institutions, such as schools, neighborhoods, government programs, and those institutions are in turn influenced by the norms, values, and policies of society. It isn't just about the contextual location within an ecological hierarchy, however, but the history of the group interactions and the socio-political forces that have, over the course of that history, dictated the value and distribution of resources, power, and social hierarchy. Using the same diversity domain from before, the cultural identity of lesbian in New York during the 1960s would have a different experience from the cultural identity of a lesbian in Portland, Oregon today. Principle 4 states that a community psychology approach to diversity focuses on strengths and resiliency within diverse groups. Forces such as privilege, oppression, and discrimination are seen as barriers to well-being. A community psychologist must not only focus on the oppression a group faces, but on the resiliency of that group. Oppressed groups find methods of resistance and find ways to maintain a positive group identity. These barriers can be overcome through empowerment and social justice. Empowerment interventions must be built on a group's natural strengths and environmental supports, since resiliency can look different across diverse groups and settings. Principle 5 states that community psychology emphasizes awareness of our own cultural identities, power, and privilege. Becoming aware of our own biases and prejudices, not only in community work with diverse groups, but in the theoretical, empirical, and interventional design, is key. We must be cognizant of our personal cultural identities, their location in our community's social hierarchy, and the domains of privilege that impact the work. These 5 overarching principles encompass how community psychologists approach diversity. Understanding how our experiences are influenced by our cultural identities, our interactions with our environments, and the forces that shape those environments is a central component to studying diversity. Oppression as a state is the result of long-term consistent oppression processes. Oppression as a process are the ways in which power is used to maintain control over resources, which limits and marginalizes others. Within diversity, oppression describes the way that one group dominates others' access to social, political, cultural, or economic resources. Oppression has political or external forces and psychological or internal forces. External forces include domination and subordination across interpersonal, societal, and global levels. And internal forces include fear and self-deprecation, both within groups and among individuals. Oppression at one level, such as institutional racism, can influence other levels, like internalized racism. Meanwhile, resistance can operate both externally and or internally, and operate across multiple levels as well. Narratives, both individual and community narratives, can be either a source of oppression, such as when the dominant cultural narratives engage in stereotyping, discriminatory, and disempowering narratives about vulnerable groups, which can lead to the oppressed becoming the oppressor over their own group. Or it can be a source of resistance, such as when individuals find community narratives that support their personal identity and meaningfully include their voice. Power plays a vital role in oppression, but has been defined differently across community psychology literature. The first saw power as a social relationship between two agents in conflict over transferable resources. The second described power as the ability to fulfill needs required for well-being, or prevent others from fulfilling their needs. And the third defined power as resulting from a structural relationship that places a person or group in an advantageous position with regard to access and control over resources. Regardless, oppression arises in these contexts of inequality because controlling the other maintains privilege via marginalization and exploitation.
From here, Patel and fellow authors shift to look at community psychology's contributions to diversity. It's important to note again that they take a contextualist perspective on their key topics, which include discrimination, inclusion, multiple oppression, and resistance. To do this, the authors did a comprehensive literature review looking at the major publications in the field, focusing on the journals where community psychologists publish. And they asked 4 questions. What factors increase or decrease one's likelihood of experiencing discrimination? What factors promote inclusion of diverse groups? What are the dynamics of oppression for members of multiple oppressed groups? And how do individuals and groups take action to resist oppression? The first area that the authors broke down after looking at the literature was to focus on discrimination, one of the key contributions made in the field of community psychology as it relates to the concept of diversity. So the community psychology approach is different from a traditional psychology approach. The traditional approach focuses on individuals, particularly individual prejudiced attitudes. Contrasting that with community psychologists, the community psychologists will look at multiple levels, including individuals, groups, organizations, even broader society, such as nations. It's important to note as well that the community psychology approach derives from an oppression ideology. Here, they look at discrimination being embedded in organizational practices and policies. And again, the community psychology approach examines outcomes of discrimination, coping and resistance, oppressive narratives, and contextual experiences. The authors also focus on contributions from the literature in the topic of discrimination. Many studies looked at predictors. What would it take for someone to be more likely to experience discrimination? And an example of the type of predictor that was found is an individual being part of a minority group. The literature focuses as well on protectors. What are the factors that can shield an individual from discrimination? Some of those include social networks and ethnic density. And finally, the authors look at the contributions that were made to understanding intergroup contact theory. This is Gordon Alpert's theory that was refined by other authors, including Pettigrew in the late 90s. But this has been a dominant theory that explains how to overcome oppression. So the idea here is that if you bring different groups together or individuals representing different groups together, that they can overcome prejudicial feelings through these 4 conditions. And the 4 conditions are that there is equal status within the group, that the group is working towards a common goal, that the institution or authority are upholding that equal status and fairness, and that the groups have considerable time to spend together. And so again, what this report found, the report of the literature, is that community psychologists have helped to affirm some of the tenets of intergroup contact theory, particularly bringing the ecological approach to the theory and its emphasis on studying people in context, as well as noting that there are several studies on acculturation that confirm the importance of the contact between these groups. The second area of the literature review looked at inclusion. So here it's important to point out that one of the reasons that community psychologists engage in research in the first place is in order to promote inclusion. So they define inclusion as the meaningful participation of diverse groups in organizational, community, or social affairs, noting that inclusion is both a psychological experience as well as an experience that's determined by structural forces. And this is one of Isaac Berletensky's definitions or contributions to the field. Again, looking at inclusion, the authors take a multi-leveled approach in the literature review, pointing out those contributions again from the literature and focusing again on the importance of looking at groups in many different contexts. They also point out that the literature notes that cultural norms are very important. The third area of focus in the literature review was looking at multiple oppression. It's probably easiest to think of this topic with a popular term that many people use today, and that's intersectionality. So looking at the complex interplay among identities of multiple oppressions and how multiple identities interact to create unique experiences of oppression, but also resilience. So again, in the literature, community psychologists have contributed by looking at unique opportunities for empowerment and change within those intersecting identities. The literature also has explored oppressor dynamics, meaning that someone who is experiencing oppression as part of their membership of one identity could also be acting as an oppressor as part of their membership with another identity. The authors also point out here the importance of the contribution of qualitative research. Conducting qualitative research has really allowed community psychologists to have a deeper understanding of the complexity behind these multiple oppressions. And the final area uncovered through the literature review is the focus on resistance. And here, the authors noted that most of the literature, if not all of the literature, takes this adaptive responding framework. Here, the goal of this adaptive responding framework is for marginalized individuals to thrive and survive by finding ways to fulfill material, physical, emotional, and psychological needs. For the most part, adaptive responding looks at the individual setting, but it can also be applied to organizational and community levels. It's important to note that this includes resilience in individual coping strategies, as well as socio-political development and group-level social activism. Some of the examples here of what the adaptive responding framework looks at or can do for individuals, it can help shift from oppressive narratives to resistance narratives, and marginalized individuals can respond to the internalized oppression that they're exhibiting. And it can also help groups to become active participants in activity settings. Activity settings are places where individuals who are experiencing oppression and discrimination can come together in unity. And examples of those might be a church or a community group. And finally, it's important to note that these interventions within the adaptive responding framework are very dependent on how oppression is manifested in different contexts.
Traditionally, the goal of psychological theory, research, and intervention is to treat the individual. This comes from a deficit model, however, and the approach implies that there is an expert on a particular issue. The randomized controlled trial, or RCT, uses highly controlled conditions to test an individual intervention aimed at reducing symptoms of distress. However, research produced from this method may not generalize to individuals or communities from diverse social and cultural backgrounds, may not easily be translated to real-world community practice, and may limit participation buy-in to treatments if there is no community involvement. To make evidence-based treatments, or EBT, more culturally sensitive, the ecological validity model for cultural adaptation treatment protocols suggests using language, personas, metaphors, content, concepts, goals, methods, and context. Taking context into consideration is key. At its core, community psychology seeks to view people and their problems as existing in context that interact to maintain or reduce individual suffering. Recommendations for future community intervention research include 4 assertions for community interventions. 1. Community interventions to address disparities seek to not only strengthen welfare, but also to enhance capacity to promote future welfare. 2. Community interventions are complex interactions during which goals emerge and are defined by the community rather than an outsider being the sole expert. 3. Collaborative interventions are essential. Sharing the decision-making, power, and influence over an intervention process is a key part of community resource development and addresses many inequalities underlying health disparities. 4. Culture pervades all aspects of community interventions. It is a fundamental set of defining qualities of community life out of which interventions flow. More and more, community-based participatory research is used in order to address issues of diversity. Researchers argued for 4 dimensions: applying a cultural perspective to the evaluation of risk-benefits, developing and implementing respectful informed consent, constructing confidentiality and disclosure policies sensitive to cultural values, and engaging community and participation consultation. Throughout it all, it is important to note that without careful formation of community and academic partnerships, there wouldn't be much success.
So in sum, Patel and the other authors wrap up by noting some important contributions again and looking for the way forward for community psychologists to continue their research in areas of diversity, multiculturalism, and inclusion. So important to know that exclusion can be addressed when research and action paradigms incorporate community participation, where researchers are focused on resilience and resistance in their interventions, and when they're drawing upon other disciplines and bringing diverse perspectives to solutions. Finally, it's important to note that community psychology has strong theory as in their approach to diversity, but it needs to work further to development strategies and implementation. Looking to the future, it will be important to focus on technology and forces of globalization, and it's really important to note that the research is spotty. It's well developed with some populations, but needs to go much further with others. So we have a few critiques of this article. One is that critical theory was largely absent. In diversity, equity, and inclusion work, the word equity is very important, looking at anti-racist frameworks. And here the shift was to really look at diversity, multiculturalism, and inclusion. And so some of the difficult conversations around power and who holds power weren't really addressed in this article or in the research that the authors were reviewing in the literature review. Another criticism that we had is that the authors do state at the beginning of the article that much of the research that they're reporting on focuses on a UX context, but they argue that the conclusions are generalizable to an international perspective. And this seems to be a bit contradictory when we think about the emphasis on local context being so important to community psychology. Finally, there were concerns with the emphasis on empowerment, noting that even though the authors go to great extents to talk about the importance of community contributions to research and making sure that community psychologists don't take an expert approach or the etiquette approach, nonetheless, many of the interventions suggested focus on the concept of empowerment, which we feel has a paternalistic approach. These ways of looking at diversity in many ways seem contradictory to some of the asset-based frameworks and participatory research frameworks offered by community psychologists.